The prevailing historiographical narrative frequently delineates the entry of the United States into the Second World War as a binary event precipitated by the catastrophic and sudden attacks of December 7, 1941. However, a forensic analysis of the period spanning April to December 1941, designated herein as Phase 2, reveals a divergent and far more complex reality. Rather than an abrupt cessation of neutrality, this era is characterized by a gradual, kinetic escalation of hostilities within the North Atlantic theater, creating a strategic anomaly wherein the nation remained legislatively isolated while its naval forces engaged in high-intensity combat. It is posited that the United States Navy was engaged in a de facto belligerency against Axis forces long before the formal abrogation of diplomatic relations, executing a deliberate, incremental strategy to secure transatlantic logistical corridors through the projection of sovereignty, the manipulation of international legal norms, and the application of lethal force. This period represents not a prelude to war, but a distinct phase of conflict characterized by a unique set of political constraints, operational realities, and aggressive executive overreach that fundamentally redefined the concept of neutrality. The study of Phase 2 is thus critical to understanding the elasticity of executive power during a period of legislative constraint and the profound operational challenges inherent in modern naval warfare. The precedents set by the executive branch during this 9-month period fundamentally altered the balance of power between the presidency and Congress in matters of foreign military commitment and established a lasting template for undeclared intervention. The strategic necessity of maintaining the Atlantic Bridge, central to the Rainbow Five war plan, superseded the legislative isolationism mandated by the Neutrality Acts, compelling the United States toward an active, if undeclared, belligerency. The transition from passive observation to active intervention was not merely rhetorical, but was manifested through radical alterations in geopolitical boundaries and the redefinition of the Western Hemisphere itself. The foundational mechanism for this expansion was the unilateral extension of the Pan-American Security Zone. Originally conceived via the Declaration of Panama in October 1939 as a buffer to exclude belligerent acts from the Americas, a cordon sanitaire of approximately 300 nautical miles, the zone's utility was inverted in April 1941 to project American power eastward. By extending the boundary to longitude 26 degrees west, approximately 2,300 nautical miles east of New York, and strategically encompassing the Azores, the executive branch effectively encompassed the vast majority of North Atlantic shipping routes within the defensive sphere of the United States. This expansion was strategically prefigured by the Destroyers for Bases Agreement of September 1940, which, while not immediately involving combat, transferred 50 obsolescent destroyers to the Royal Navy in exchange for leases on bases from Newfoundland to British Guiana, thereby securing the logistical flank of the Atlantic long before Phase 2 commenced. This agreement, structured to bypass legislative opposition and ratified solely by executive agreement, provided the first material evidence of the administration's commitment to prioritizing British survival over constitutional neutrality, effectively trading obsolete hardware for strategically vital sovereign territory. The utilization of executive agreements in lieu of formal treaties demonstrated a calculated avoidance of the Senate's constitutional oversight, circumventing isolationist opposition by framing the transfer as a simple exchange of assets rather than an act of aid to a belligerent. This act of cartographic aggression fundamentally altered the operational landscape. It placed the mid-ocean gap, previously a sanctuary for Axis submarines known as the Black Pit, due to the lack of land-based air cover, under the surveillance of a neutral superpower. Within this expanded zone, the implementation of specific operational protocols, most notably the directive to broadcast in clear, functioned to integrate American reconnaissance with British offensive capabilities. By transmitting unencrypted coordinates of Axis submarines and surface raiders, United States naval assets, such as PBY Catalina patrol aircraft and destroyers, acted as the observational arm of the Allied command structure. This intelligence, once intercepted by British listening stations, facilitated the vectoring of Royal Navy anti-submarine warfare, ASW, a set to prosecute attacks, effectively rendering the U.S. Navy a force multiplier for the British Admiralty. The strategic implication was that a German U-boat could be detected by a neutral aircraft, which would then guide a belligerent destroyer to the target, creating an untenable operational environment for the Kriegsmarine. The assertion of a defensive zone extending over 2,000 nautical miles into a recognized European theater constituted an unprecedented claim under international law, essentially transforming the United States from a guarantor of regional peace to a combat support agent. This radical reinterpretation of hemispheric defense laid the conceptual groundwork for subsequent American military interventions globally, often under the guise of security patrols, and established the doctrine of preclusive defense, far from sovereign shores. The initial failure of the original 300-mile zone to deter German surface raiders like the Admiral Scheer provided the necessary political expediency for this unilateral eastward expansion, demonstrating the inadequacy of purely passive defense mechanisms against contemporary naval warfare tactics. The legal audacity of the extension was further complicated by the fact that the United States did not formally consult with all Pan-American signatories, treating the zone not as a collective security measure, but as an instrument of executive foreign policy, enforceable by the U.S. Atlantic Fleet alone. The sheer geographical scope of this claim unilaterally shifted the burden of diplomatic responsibility and military risk onto the Axis powers. The continuous shadowing and reporting actions undertaken by American warships were a clear violation of the customary law of neutrality, which obligates a neutral state to treat belligerents equally and refrain from aiding either side in a conflict. This aggressive interpretation of neutrality patrol fundamentally redefined the diplomatic obligations of non-belligerent nations in modern total war. Furthermore, this cooperation extended into the clandestine realm of cryptanalysis and signals intelligence. The collaboration between the British Admiralty's Submarine Tracking Room, under Commander Roger Wynne, and the United States Navy's OP-20G, under Commander Kenneth Knowles, was a deep organizational integration that facilitated the rerouting of convoys based on deciphered ultra-intelligence and high-frequency direction finding HF/DF fixes. The technology of HF/DF allowed American and Allied vessels to pinpoint the position of U-boats merely by intercepting their routine, low-power radio traffic to headquarters. This ability to obtain an approximate bearing on the U-boat, often within a critical 5-mile radius, even before visual or sonar contact, proved invaluable. By the autumn of 1941, the U.S. Navy was actively diverting merchant traffic away from known U-boat concentrations, a form of defensive warfare that denied the Germans targets and frustrated their wolfpack tactics. This integrated intelligence framework allowed for the active management of the Atlantic convoys, shifting the focus from purely reactive defense to strategic denial and proactive resource protection. The resultant reduction in successful U-boat attacks on Allied shipping traversing the extended zone demonstrated the acute operational effectiveness of this intelligence fusion. The deployment of U.S. Coast Guard cutters and destroyers specifically trained in Huff-Duff operation added a crucial layer of tactical intelligence to the convoy screen, permitting escorts to close on U-boats communicating position reports. Such measures, while ostensibly defensive in nature, constituted a substantive breach of strict neutrality, eliciting formal protests from Grand Admiral Erich Raeder regarding the strategic encirclement of the Kriegsmarine. It is notable that German retaliation was restrained solely by Adolf Hitler's strategic imperative to avoid premature American entry into the war during the critical phases of Operation Barbarossa, creating a strategic paradox where the neutral power was the aggressor and the belligerent power exercised restraint. This policy of executive restraint cost the Kriegsmarine critical months of uncontested operational space off the American coast, a period during which the U.S. rapidly accelerated its convoy escort training and organizational structure. The commitment of U.S. intelligence assets, traditionally focused on the Pacific theater, to the Atlantic underscored the highest levels of strategic prioritization for the defeat of the Third Reich. This intelligence sharing was, in effect, a highly sophisticated form of economic and military warfare conducted beneath the threshold of official declaration. The establishment of the Atlantic Fleet's headquarters under Admiral King ensured that operational directives flowed directly from the White House's strategic vision, bypassing formal diplomatic channels entirely. The integration of U.S. naval intelligence into the British operational system, including the sharing of decrypted German communication, albeit highly compartmentalized, established a functional, if secret, military alliance months before Pearl Harbor. Concurrently, the acquisition of forward operating bases to secure the Great Circle route was pursued through unconventional diplomatic and military channels. The security of the northern flank was deemed essential for the protection of the Atlantic Bridge, the logistical artery sustaining the British war effort following the passage of the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941. Without secure refueling points and air cover, the sheer volume of material required to sustain the United Kingdom could not be delivered across the submarine-infested waters, jeopardizing the core premise of the arsenal of democracy. This strategic necessity compelled the occupation of key insular territories to establish a continuous perimeter of defense and surveillance. The Kaufman Agreement regarding Greenland serves as a primary exemplar of this policy. In April 1941, the defense of the territory was transferred to the United States by Henrik de Kaufmann, the Danish minister in Washington. Kaufmann acted contra legem to the specific instructions of the German-occupied government in Copenhagen, asserting that the sovereignty of the Danish crown could not be exercised under duress. This diplomatic coup secured critical meteorological stations, vital for forecasting weather over the European theater, as weather systems generally track west to east, and guaranteed access to the cryolite mines at Ivitut. This mineral was the world's only commercial source of cryolite, indispensable for the refining of aluminium and, by extension, the production of United States military aircraft. The construction of the Bluey airfield complexes provided vital waypoints for short-range aircraft being ferried to England, creating an aerial bridge alongside the maritime one. Furthermore, the agreement contained Article 10, which granted the U.S. a veto over any future change to the treaty, ensuring the permanence of the American presence regardless of Denmark's future political status, a move that formalized America's long-term strategic interest in the Arctic region. The establishment of U.S. bases in Greenland also served the purpose of denying the German military the ability to establish clandestine weather reporting stations, which were crucial for planning U-boat movements and Luftwaffe operations. This acquisition of sovereign rights over a foreign territory, under the legal justification of rebus sic stantibus, things standing thus, was a profound departure from traditional peacetime diplomacy. The control of the Greenland coast also enabled the implementation of a comprehensive North Atlantic weather reporting network that provided critical advantages to Allied air and sea operations, particularly for the planning of long-range air patrols. The strategic deployment included the establishment of a robust ice patrol system, essential for securing the transit of winter convoys, underscoring the shift from symbolic patrolling to operational responsibility for the entire sea lane environment. This strategic expansion culminated in Operation Indigo in July 1941, which necessitated the deployment of the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade and subsequent Army units to Iceland. The garrisoning of a European nation by United States forces, eventually numbering nearly 30,000 personnel, fundamentally altered the strategic calculus. By establishing a major naval operating base at Hvalfjörður, Whale Fjord, and deploying patrol aircraft from Icelandic fields, the United States effectively closed the mid-Atlantic air gap. This action, described by Winston Churchill as pointing a pistol at the heart of the Atlantic, allowed for the continuous escort of convoy traffic from the North American coast to the mid-ocean meeting point, MOMP, south of Iceland, where British escorts would assume responsibility. This handover system integrated the United States Navy directly into the Allied logistical system, making American warships the primary guardians of British imports for the western half of the voyage, a clear commitment of force to a belligerent theater of operations. The establishment of these northern bases, including the U.S. Army Air Force's installation at Keflavik, originally a Royal Air Force base, ensured that the strategic commitment to the Atlantic First strategy, enshrined in the Rainbow Five War Plan, could be logistically executed. The American Naval Command took over administrative control of the MOMP, signifying a profound operational commitment that transcended mere neutrality patrols. This occupation was further formalized by the establishment of Task Force 4, the designated support force, which became the operational arm executing the combat duties in the eastern sector of the extended security zone. Furthermore, the U.S. Navy established Argentia, Newfoundland, as a primary deep-water operating base, completing the triangular logistical chain necessary to support continuous patrol and escort duties across the North Atlantic. The logistical strain of maintaining such a distant force was immense, requiring the immediate construction of vast storage facilities and harbor defenses to ensure the continuity of operations, regardless of German interdiction efforts. The political sensitivity of the occupation necessitated the official declaration that U.S. forces were guests of the Icelandic government, maintaining a thin veneer of non-belligerency for domestic and international consumption, even as the scale of the American presence dwarfed the island's native population. The deployment of U.S. battleships and aircraft carriers, such as the USS Wasp and Yorktown, to the Atlantic theater during Phase 2 further underlined the depth of the commitment, demonstrating that naval assets were being prioritized based on the German threat, despite rising tensions in the Pacific. The successful relief of British forces allowed for the redeployment of veteran Commonwealth troops to critical theaters like North Africa, directly impacting the balance of military power outside the North Atlantic. The shift in geography was accompanied by a commensurate shift in rules of engagement, ROE, codified in Western Hemisphere Defense Plan No. 4, WPL 51, and Operation Plan 741. Issued by Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief, Atlantic Fleet, Sin Clant, this directive introduced a belligerent definition of threat, authorizing American warships to engage Axis vessels based solely on their presence in shipping lanes or proximity to convoys, rather than requiring a prior hostile act. Specifically, the order mandated the destruction of hostile forces that threatened shipping, effectively constituting an offensive order masked as a defensive measure. However, the execution of these orders was hampered by significant technological asymmetries that placed American sailors at a distinct disadvantage. The United States escort force was heavily reliant on World War I-era four-Piper destroyers, Wicks and Clemson classes. While these vessels had been cutting edge in 1918, by 1941, they were obsolete. They lacked the structural resilience of modern warships, possessing a wide turning radius that made anti-submarine maneuvering difficult, and were notoriously unstable in the rough seas of the North Atlantic. Their flush deck design meant they were extremely wet ships. In heavy swells, the rolling was so violent that manual gunnery operations were often rendered impossible, and crew fatigue became a critical operational factor, reducing sustained combat effectiveness. The severe structural fragmentation observed in the loss of the Reuben James was a direct consequence of this outdated design philosophy, illustrating a critical failure in the preparedness of the fleet for high-intensity, sustained combat operations. The vulnerability of these vessels forced the Navy to rely heavily on the few modern destroyers available, straining the operational tempo across the theater. The handful of newer Gleaves-class destroyers, such as the Carney, possessed superior compartmentalization and advanced sonar arrays, but their limited numbers were insufficient to offset the deficiencies of the aged fleet. The high steam consumption of the older ships also limited their sustained operational range compared to modern British corvettes, often necessitating mid-ocean refueling, which further complicated convoy logistics. Furthermore, the poor habitability of the older ships severely impacted crew readiness during the grueling, extended North Atlantic patrols. The four-piper design, despite wartime modifications, proved fundamentally incapable of withstanding the shock damage inflicted by U-boat torpedoes, often suffering catastrophic failure due to the lack of internal bulkheads and double hulls common in newer designs. The urgent need to remedy this structural and technological deficit spurred the creation of dedicated destroyer escorts, DES, the first of which were designed during this period, signifying a late but essential pivot to purpose-built ASW platforms. Critically, these vessels were deficient in the electronic warfare domain. While equipped with sonar, sound navigation, and ranging, they largely lacked effective surface search radar, such as the British Type 271. This left them vulnerable to the preferred German Rudel, Wolfpack tactic of night surface attacks. In these engagements, the low silhouette of a surfaced Type 7 U-boat rendered it nearly invisible to optical lookouts against the dark Atlantic horizon, while the high profile of the destroyers presented a distinct target. Furthermore, American destroyers relied on stern-dropped depth charges and Y-gun throwers. The failure to deploy weapons that could project ordnance forward of the attacking vessel, such as the British Hedgehog mortar, necessitated that a destroyer pass directly over the submerged target to attack. This maneuver often broke sonar contact at the critical moment of engagement due to the ship's own wake and noise, the baffles, allowing the U-boat to evade detection during the attack run. Furthermore, early American torpedoes and depth-charge fuses suffered from pervasive technical failures, most notoriously the Mk6 depth-charge pistol, which frequently failed to detonate properly or at the correct depth, further eroding the effectiveness of the USASW assets. The Americans were playing catch-up in a technological race already dominated by the U-boat's tactical superiority in night surface action. This technological lag underscored the strategic risk undertaken by the U.S. government in pushing its forces into combat prematurely. The rapid development and deployment of American shipborne radar systems, e.g. the SG radar, only began in earnest after the severe losses of late 1941, initiating a crash program of technological modernization. Compounding the material deficiencies was the lack of experienced ASW personnel. The U.S. Navy entered Phase 2, requiring immediate, accelerated training in fleet maneuvers and coordinated Wolfpack defense tactics. This learning curve proved costly in human lives, but was ultimately essential for the eventual victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. The operational reality of Phase 2 was defined by a series of escalating armed confrontations that systematically dissolved the distinction between non-belligerency and active warfare. The first hostile action, arguably, occurred as early as April 10, 1941, when the USS Niblack deployed depth charges against a suspected contact off Iceland, setting a precedent for aggressive defense long before the formal extension of the security zone. Prior to the naval engagements, the sinking of the American merchant vessel SS Robin Moore in May 1941 by U-69, an act of unrestricted submarine warfare against a neutral flag, provided early political ammunition, leading to the freezing of Axis assets in the United States and the denunciation of Germany as an outlaw nation. The unprovoked nature of the attack, which occurred far south of the main convoy routes, was leveraged by the administration to demonstrate the existential threat posed by the Axis powers to all maritime commerce and freedom of the seas, a foundational element of American foreign policy. The incident involving the USS Greer, DD-145, on September 4, 1941, serves as the definitive turning point. While executive pronouncements characterized the engagement as an unprovoked attack upon a peaceful mail ship, naval records indicate the destroyer was actively tracking U-652 for several hours and coordinating with British aerial assets that had previously attacked the submarine. The U-boat commander, believing the surface ship was the source of the depth charges, fired in self-defense. This event was subsequently utilized by President Roosevelt in his Fireside Chat 18 as the political predicate for the shoot-on-sight order. By omitting the context of the Greer's aggressive tracking and the active intelligence sharing, the administration successfully framed the incident as an act of piracy against a neutral vessel, justifying the authorization for the preemptive destruction of Axis naval units found within the strategic waters of the Atlantic. The ensuing order effectively terminated naval neutrality. Roosevelt's speech, broadcast widely, employed highly emotive language, comparing the U-boat to a rattlesnake, thereby simplifying a complex operational engagement into a clear-cut moral confrontation necessary to secure public support for a de facto war footing. This rhetorical strategy was essential for overcoming deep-seated isolationist sentiment within Congress, which maintained the power to declare war, and it effectively shifted the burden of escalation onto Germany. On October 17, 1941, the war turned lethal. A massive wolfpack attacked convoy SC-48 south of Iceland. The USS Kearney, DD-432, a modern Gleaves-class destroyer dispatched to reinforce the overwhelmed escorts, maneuvered to screen the merchant ships. At night, silhouetted by a burning tanker, the Kearney was struck on the starboard side by a torpedo from U-568. The explosion breached the forward boiler room, killing 11 sailors and wounding 22. The survival of the Kearney was attributed largely to her modern compartmentalization and robust damage control, features critically lacking in the older destroyer classes. This marked the first American combat fatalities of the war against Germany, a psychological threshold that hardened naval resolve and demonstrated the vulnerability of even the newer vessels to focused wolfpack attack. The bravery of the Kearney's crew in managing the damage under fire was widely publicized within naval circles, boosting morale despite the casualty count, and serving as a testament to the efficacy of the newer, damage-resistant designs. 2 weeks later, on October 31, 1941, the United States Navy suffered its first total loss of a warship. The USS Reuben James, DD-245, a fragile Clemson-class destroyer, was escorting convoy HX-156. While positioning herself to intercept a radio direction-finding bearing, she was struck by a torpedo from U-552, commanded by Eric Topp. The ensuing explosion ignited the forward magazine, blowing the entire bow off the ship. The vessel sank in less than 5 minutes in the freezing waters. Of the crew of 136, only 44 survived. All officers were lost. This tragedy underscored the high-intensity nature of the war of attrition already underway and highlighted the severe vulnerability of the legacy fleet, serving as a stark memorial to the reality of the undeclared war. The loss immediately prompted the Atlantic Fleet Command to review and tighten convoy screening procedures, focusing particularly on the defense of the vulnerable flanks and adopting more aggressive counterattack maneuvers. The public shock cemented the perception that American servicemen were actively fighting and dying in defense of Britain. Concurrently, the conflict expanded to other vessel types. On October 30th, the fleet oiler USS Salinas, AO-19, was engaged by U-106, absorbing 2 torpedo strikes but managing to return to port, demonstrating the resilience of the auxiliary fleet that would prove crucial in the Pacific theater. Furthermore, on November 6th, the cruiser USS Omaha and destroyer USS Somers intercepted the German blockade runner Odenwald in the equatorial Atlantic. Disguised as the American merchantman Wilmoto, the German crew attempted to scuttle the ship upon boarding. American sailors aggressively intervened, preventing the scuttling and capturing the vessel intact. This seizure of a belligerent naval auxiliary by a neutral power on the high seas was a clear enforcement of belligerent rights and the application of prize law, an act historically reserved for declared combatants. The incident generated legal precedent regarding the interception and seizure of vessels engaging in deceptive practices within the defense zone. To fully comprehend the dynamics of Phase 2, one must consider the strategic constraints imposed upon the Kriegsmarine. Throughout 1941, the aggression in the Atlantic was asymmetric. The U.S. Navy was seeking engagement, while the German Navy was under strict orders to avoid it. Admiral Raeder and the U-boat force commander Karl Dönitz petitioned Adolf Hitler for the authorization to engage American naval forces, arguing that the United States had engaged in acts of war, specifically the intelligence support and depth charging, that necessitated a kinetic response. They meticulously documented every American action to build a legal justification for an eventual declaration of war, including the coordinates and timing of American vessel activities. However, Hitler, consumed by the campaign on the Eastern Front, was desperate to keep the United States out of the war until the Soviet Union was defeated. Fearing a repetition of 1917, wherein unrestricted submarine warfare precipitated American entry into the First World War, Hitler issued strict no provocation orders. This created a strategic asymmetry wherein United States forces were permitted to hunt U-boats, while U-boat commanders were largely forbidden from counterattacking unless in immediate self-defense. This strategic constraint proved immensely frustrating to Dönitz, who correctly identified the operational peril posed by the American-British coordination. The necessity of avoiding American engagement meant that U-boat captains frequently had to abort patrols or allow American-flagged vessels to pass unmolested, severely degrading the efficacy of the Kriegsmarine's Atlantic campaign. Dönitz accurately argued that this restraint was functionally equivalent to conceding the Battle of the Atlantic to the Allies without a fight. It was only following the formal declaration of war on December 11, 1941, that this restraint was lifted, unleashing the second happy time of unrestricted attacks along the American seaboard in early 1942. Parallel to the naval conflict, the legislative framework of isolationism was systematically dismantled on the domestic front. The administration utilized the naval incidents of Phase 2 as political leverage to erode the Neutrality Acts of 1935, 1937, and 1939. Following the attacks on the Carney and Reuben James, The Roosevelt administration successfully lobbied for the repeal of Sections 2 and 3 of the 1939 Act. The legislative debate was acrimonious, with isolationists, often grouped under the influential America First Committee, arguing correctly that the proposed changes would guarantee war and that the executive branch was exceeding its constitutional mandate by initiating hostilities without congressional approval. Nevertheless, on November 13, 1941, the House of Representatives passed the revisions by a razor-thin margin of 212 to 194. By November 1941, the prohibition against arming merchant vessels was rescinded, and the ban on American ships entering designated combat zones was lifted. Consequently, United States merchantmen were immediately equipped with deck guns and naval-armed guard crews and were authorized to sail directly into British ports, removing the need to transfer cargo at Iceland. This legislative maneuver effectively removed the final legal barriers to full participation in the Atlantic War, rendering the distinction between neutrality and alliance purely semantic. The razor-thin margins of these votes revealed a nation deeply divided, yet legally committed to a course of war. The political utility of the naval casualties proved sufficient to secure the required legislative majority. It is therefore concluded that the events of December 7, 1941, did not initiate the conflict for the United States Navy, but rather signaled the opening of a secondary theater of operations. By the evening of December 6th, the legislative barriers of the Neutrality Acts had been removed. The strategic frontiers had been extended to the coast of Europe, and naval forces were engaged in lethal, daily combat against the Kriegsmarine. The Phase 2 period constitutes a state of undeclared, yet fully realized naval warfare. Thus, for the personnel of the Atlantic Fleet, already veterans of the Wolfpack battles, the transition to global war was not a fundamental change in activity, but merely a modification of the rules of engagement, from the restrictive shoot-on-sight protocols to the total commitment of unlimited war. The history of 1941 is therefore not a story of peace interrupted, but of a calculated, slow-motion entry into the global conflagration, achieved through strategic deception and incremental engagement. The legacy of Phase 2 is the precedent it established for executive military action outside formal declarations of war, predicated on the strategic necessity of defending globally extended interests. The period served as a critical, albeit brutal, apprenticeship for the U.S. Navy in ASW, preparing it organizationally and doctrinally for the full scope of the global conflict that was to follow.